Everybody to sit down so that we can start this opening plenary session. You've obviously been very taxed by Claude Smarja and Rakesh Mohan over the last hour and a half. You've been made to brainstorm, report back. Claude is a very strong headmaster, and he has made you work. So we thought we'd give you a 5-minute stretch break before we start. Thank you very much for settling down. Now this session is on the theme of this year's Growth Net, reversing growth, or rather reviving growth, reversing the tide. When we were first planning this conference and we were discussing the theme, we were talking about sustaining growth. And then we realized that all around the world, growth has come down. And we really need to rethink the title of this conference. And that's how we came up with this one-liner, reviving growth, reversing the tide. And my questions to this outstanding panel will be around this theme. But let me first introduce the panel, and I'm going to start in the reverse order of their speaking. The last person who I will put a question to is Mr. Wang Shi. He has a $29 billion corporation operating in 66 cities. He is the world's leading, the #1 residential home developer. He is now globalizing. He's moving into North America. And as I was telling some friends just now, one of these days, you will go to an apartment building which is 63 floors on 45th and Lexington, and it'll be by Vanke, his company. So he's an amazing person. If you have read his biodata in the participants booklet, you will know that he has climbed Everest twice. He is a mountaineer. He is also an academic. He spent time at Harvard and more recently in Cambridge. So a man of many parts. And we are very privileged that he has come from China to be with us at this second Growth Net. The second last person who I will question is Clyde Prestowitz. Clyde was here with us last year. He's president of the Economic Strategy Institute in Washington, D.C. We wanted an American perspective, even though we are focusing essentially on the growth economies of the world. And Clyde has been deeply involved over the years on international trade policy issues, on competitiveness issues, and all the issues which connect the world and also divide the world in many ways. And he's had particular involvement in America's trade policy arrangements with Japan, with China, and Korea. To my right is Mr. Wang Huyao. He is the founding Director General of the Center for China Globalization. But he is very deeply involved in talent and particularly focusing on getting Chinese talent back into China. And we were just talking a little while ago, which neither Dr. Ahluwalia or I knew, that for Indians resident abroad, They can get a card, persons of Indian origin card. They don't need a visa to come back to India. But for the Chinese living abroad, they still have to get a visa to come to China. So we have recommended to him that he should quickly change this. Yes. And at least in one example, he should follow India.
That's right.
To make it easier for Chinese to come back to India.
Yes.
And the person to whom I will turn first, and I introduce last, is Dr. Montek Ahluwalia. His title is Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission. That title does not do justice to his role and his contribution. He has been in the government since the late 70s, except for a brief spell when he was at the IMF. He is a member of the Indian cabinet, enjoys the rank of a cabinet minister. He's put out on television every time the economy is in distress to explain and bring confidence back to the people. He has been a central figure in our liberalization and deregulation process over the last 20 years. And it's been my privilege to work with him from outside government since 1979. He's a great believer in the open economy. Now, as you will notice, we have two gentlemen from China. And coincidentally, Dr. Ahluwalia has just come back from China because he co-chairs the India-China Economic Dialogue, as he does the India-US Economic Dialogue, and if I'm not mistaken, also the Energy Dialogue with US, and something similar with Japan, etc., etc., etc. I think, so as I said earlier, his title is Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, but his role is much wider. Dr. Ahluwalia, I'm going to start with you. We are not focusing, preferably now, on understanding what happened. We'd like to focus on the future. How do we reverse the tide of declining growth? How do we get growth back, not only into India, but the emerging economies and into the world? You are part also of the G20 process from the very beginning. You've been in all the meetings, and the G20 leaders have been discussing this, perhaps to no avail. So when you look at the international situation, when you look at India, what do you see as some of the key priorities for bringing growth back? What are the key priorities for reversing the tide? Dr. Ahluwalia.
Well, pretty big question.
Yeah.
The world and India. So let me be very brief. First of all, everybody in the world, in all these international meetings.
Can everybody hear? No. Volume. Okay, let's try it again.
Okay, maybe jack this up. Yeah, is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Well, in all the international meetings where these things are being discussed, I mean, they're focusing on how do you get growth back, and linked to that, how do you get employment back. And quite honestly, for a long time globally, the real problem was the tension between, on the one hand, those who felt that the fiscal deficits had to be brought under control in order to bring the overall debt to GDP ratio down. In the industrialized countries, the debt to GDP ratio has really exploded. I mean, they were well below India, they're now well above India. But the debate always was, and if you try to bring the fiscal deficit down at a point when private consumers are also deleveraging, you're going to have a very negative effect on growth. in every discussion that I've been in, the focus has always been that the industrialized countries, which really in this context means the European countries, because the US is beginning to recover and not doing badly at all, that somehow they're going to do a whole lot of structural reforms which will enthuse investors and will bring investor confidence back, even if consumer confidence takes time to recover. I think basically that's not succeeded. And I don't want to go into it because I'm just heading out to the G20 Sherpas meeting. This is a standard problem that, one likes to believe that if you can do a whole lot of reforms, it will enthuse investors. But the problem is if you get yourself into a situation where the investment climate has become unduly negative, then it takes quite a lot of time and many things have to happen in order to revive investor activity. And I'm not sure that in the global environment, people know very much more than just the formula that I put forward. I think as far as India is concerned, we have a better idea of what I think we need to do. Raghuram Rajan was recently asked, why has India slowed down? I mean, the slowdown is very evident, and people think that, the government tends to explain this as simply the global slowdown. That's not actually true. We have consistently said that surely the global slowdown had some effect, but there were domestic problems that have to be addressed. And I think we know what those problems are. We do need to address them. They relate really to speeding up a number of regulatory constraints which hold up the implementation of large projects. The government has set up a mechanism to do that, and from what I know, certainly the number of clearances has increased hugely. But I think there's another factor also, and that is the financial situation facing investors. I mean, it's quite normal in a boom that a lot of investors overextend themselves, and when you get closer to a slowdown, the chickens come home to roost. This is happening at a time when globally there's lots of financial uncertainty. So it's not as if this has happened simply in an Indian environment, a kind of up and down movement, but it's happening at a time when globally also banks are unwilling to lend everywhere. So we clearly have to proceed with the acceleration of the implementation of large projects through improved regulatory systems. I think that's happening. We probably have to do something to look at the financial constraints that may be affecting Indian banks. Hopefully the Reserve Bank of India is looking at that. And I think looking further ahead, we need to identify 3 or 4 major reforms which are in the pipeline, which have been discussed, but now I think are ready to be implemented. Now in the Indian case, we are in the middle of a general election, and whatever the outcome of the general election, this is a period when political noise will be very high, and virtually all investors must be waiting to let the system settle down. I'm quite hopeful that at the end of the election, whatever government comes to power, we will be in a position to get moving on some of these major things. I mean, one of them, for example, is the goods and services tax. Virtually all economists regard this as one of the most important reforms to do, and it would not only help the fiscal situation, which is important, but it would also be a great boost for efficiency in the system, integrating the market and so on. There are 3 or 4 other areas where reforms have been talked about, they're in the pipeline, and I think they should just be accelerated. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahluwalia. I'll turn next to Mr. Wang Huyao, and my question to you is about China. We see that even Chinese growth rate has come down a little bit. But we also see that the new president of China, Xi Jinping, seems to be driving reforms. So do you expect you're going back as a country to the earlier growth rates of 9–10%, or do you see growth rates being around 7, 8%. I mean, what do you see in regard to China's growth? Because that necessarily has a great impact on the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the good question. I think China has, for the last 30 years, has really enjoyed unprecedented growth, almost ranked 11%. But recent few years, China actually has slowed down because the magnitude, the economy of the scale, and so we see China now is ranked about 7 to 8%. At the just finished National People's Congress section this month, the Premier Li Keqiang mentioned China trying to achieve 7.5% for the current year. So you see that China still, even though with the base of building up for the last 30 years of high growth, it's very challenging to continue the 10, 11%. So it has to come down. It has to got a quality percent. So the China's actually the contribution to the world is like 5% of the world GDP around the year of 2000. Now it's about China counts about 12% of world GDP. But we see, what actually China has to do now is really the structural changes. For example, now China used to rely heavily on the infrastructure, on the real estate, on the many other sectors. China has done a lot of that. For example, the China highway and the speed highway and the speed railway. Now both are over 100,000 kilometers, the longest in the world. And also you see the infrastructure is basically airports, it's everywhere, everything is there. So what's going to be the next drive to really make China grow? And that's a question I think we have to ask, and really the government also have to think about. I think when President Xi Jinping comes up now, about over a year now, the Chinese government, I think, is trying to really push for the structural reform, and particularly after the 18th Party Congress, the third plenum, that they have proposed many measures to reform plans to really to go about that. And we start to see some result. Actually, for example, China was, for the last year, China became the largest trading nation in the world, actually surpassed first time the United States. But that's not really the only thing. But I think the most important is domestically, the consumption is actually reached 50% of the GDP. And also for the service sector, it's actually reached 46%. Even though it's not that as high as India, but it's not easy for China. But first time reached 46%. And that actually surpassed the first and second industry. It's better than agriculture now, better than the industry now. And what we also see is, for example, the online, the other sectors are booming. For example, the online industry is really unprecedented growth. Last year, it's jumped 40% of the revenue. It's about $300 billion US dollars, online sales. And even one of the Chinese big online company, Alibaba, proposed a bachelor's day, on November 11, 1111. It became a bachelor's day, and that drives the consumer holidays in China. And then online, on that one day sales, it's almost like 30 billion RMB on one day. So you can see there's a lot of new area that trying to get the growth for sustain that. But I think probably most challenging is for China is how to get an investor-driven economy to a service-driven economy. That's need a lot of changes. For example, China is now trying to do the urbanization is one of the big program going on in China. Urbanization now in China, according to the people in the city, it's about 51% now. From 51% of people living in the cities. But then actually, if you're looking at people who really have the city resident permit, it's only 35% that has the right to enjoy the city's privileges and social benefits. So there's a lot of challenges for that, and actually there's a pressure for the government to deliver all those outcomes of the reform. And also I think there's another area of the modern agriculture, the green technology, anti-pollutions, also trying to release the dividend. China used to rely heavily on the migrant workers, 250 migrant workers across China. But now there's a labor shortage everywhere, actually, in China. China are getting aging, there's a population getting aging now, and also China have to realize more on the talent development. So I think all those factors will drive China to really towards more social reform, to some extent political reform, and as Premier Li Keqiang is trying to decentralize some of the approving powers and give the rights to the, for example, the enterprise used to register a company in China used to be very difficult. Now the new government policy is that you don't need the register capital, you don't need the office, you can start to register your company now. So there's a lot of a reform dividend, as if you use the previous words, trying to push that through. So I think the challenge is how can central government policy trickle down to the local governments to really benefit the economy. For example, one area that China needs reform is on the medical front. China has about 20,000 hospitals in China. 15,000 are run by the government. And then the government is only putting 7 to 15% of the hospital fundings. So the hospitals really rely on the selling the drugs to the patient to really support the hospitals. So China now, the new government policy released, allow the social capital to get into the hospital and allow the hospital doctors to be a private practitioners. So we'll see many reforms like that to really drive China to the next stage of the growth. So they cannot rely heavily on the investment. They have to rely on the dividend of the reform. And I think they have to really keep China growth. They have to produce 11 million jobs every year to really maintain that kind of employment rate. So I think finally I want to say that it's not an easy task. As the whole world is really slowing down, I mean, the emerging economy is slowing down. We see some recovery in the US, but Europe is still in the process of recovery. And China should really maintain this 7.5%. It's really a challenge for the government now, I think. And so by having all the kind of reform policy to be implemented, also President Xi was launching this anti-corruption campaign going on to really to trying to calm down the social complaints and unrest on that. So all those probably will come into the effect that China will get all the synergy of pushing the economics through and to maintain the growth so that it can contribute to the emerging economy and also in return to the world economy in general. And finally, I want to say that since China actually become the largest beneficiary of the globalization, since China joined the WTO, China's GDP has increased 5 times for the past 12 years. China's export increased 6 times, now become the largest in the world. And China's foreign investment becomes 60 times. So I think that kind of a liberalization probably should be spread around, that we should really strengthen, as I said early in a roundtable discussion, that strengthen the WTO and global governance, that have the free trade and free investment flow around the countries between China, European, and between China, India, and other emerging economies. So that these days there's a still limitation for foreign companies coming to China, how much percentage they can come. There's also limitation for Chinese companies to go to US, and sometimes probably go to India, and India go to China. So I think maybe further liberalization of trade barriers and investment barriers could probably support the future growth of the new dividend that we need to really get the new engine of the growth, as China did in the past 12 years.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up on your remarks and a reference to US and Europe with Clyde. Clyde, the US economy clearly has a major impact on the rest of the world. The US tapering has had an impact last year on the emerging economies, as Dr. Rakesh Mohan mentioned earlier. How do you see and the European situation is very, very lukewarm in terms of growth. So how do you see the US economic situation? Are we seeing a sustained recovery? Is it a stop-go situation? Do you see a upward curve? What should the growth, the emerging economies expect as far as the US is concerned?
So I think, as Commissioner Ahluwalia mentioned earlier, in the short term, I think the U.S. Economic picture is pretty good and has pretty good implications for the emerging economies. You mentioned that the end of the Federal Reserve's policy of tapering and jump in interest rates had some immediate negative impact, but actually that the reason the Fed is making those decisions and moving toward a higher interest rate environment is precisely because it sees the U.S. economy improving and moving back into what we might call a more normal situation. I think this year the U.S. economy might grow at around 3%, which is a substantial increase from the last few years. And I think the U.S. picture, again, in the short term, in terms of investment, is positive. We have been experiencing a strong expansion of energy production in the U.S. And a lot of energy-related investment is being made in the U.S. both by American companies and by global companies from Europe and from Asia. And the U.S. unemployment rate has been declining. The housing market has largely recovered. The overhang of defaulted properties has mainly been relieved. And so I think it's good. Interestingly, because of the much higher production of oil and gas in the U.S. trade deficit has declined because imports of oil and gas have declined dramatically. And the U.S. trade deficit has declined even as imports of manufactured goods and services have increased substantially. So I think the U.S. picture is good for the U.S. and it's good for the emerging markets in the short term. In the longer term, I think the U.S. is facing very serious questions with regard to infrastructure. Those of you who travel to the U.S. frequently realize, that the U.S. infrastructure compares often very badly with infrastructure in the developing world. The U.S. education system is very uneven. We have some of the world's best universities and some of the world's worst high schools. And that has very serious long-term implications. Inequality in the U.S. has been increasing. The U.S. Gini coefficient is becoming bigger. And again, that has very serious implications, both economically and politically. So I think in the longer term, there are problems in the U.S. that could be negative for the U.S. and for the rest of the world. But at the moment, I think the picture is fairly good. If I turn, however, to Europe, while Europe is experiencing a slow recovery, it's a recovery that essentially has turned all of Europe into what I think of as a big Germany. And what I mean by that is that the German economy is strongly an export-led economy. The EU as a whole has a current account surplus of about $280 billion, and of that amount, $265 billion is Germany. But the restructuring of Europe is taking place in terms of austerity and in terms of a move toward all of the rest of Europe, all of the other European countries, also all of the Euro countries, let's say, also achieving current account surpluses. And that suggests that Europe is going to be less robust as a target of imports from the rest of the world. One economy that we haven't discussed today, but it is the world's third largest economy, is Japan. And Japan, as I'm sure you all know, is in the midst of a great experiment called Abenomics, of monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and what Abe, Prime Minister Abe, is calling the third arrow of structural reform. And again, in the short term, this appears to be having positive results. Inflation in Japan is up a bit for the first time in many years. Property prices are recovering a bit, very positive. But investment remains low. Japanese corporations are sitting on literally trillions of dollars of cash. And the effort to restructure and to reform the structural issues in Japan appears to be faltering. And so I think that the implications are uncertainty in Japan and for the rest of the world in the medium to longer term. Thank you.
Thank you, Clyde. Thank you. Chairman Wang, I turn to you. Real estate in China is now 15% of China's GDP. In 1998, it was something like 4% only. Now, the development of this sector has put a lot of pressure, a lot of demand on natural resources and energy. And that has generated probably 1/3 of China's emissions. As the largest real estate developer that you are, banking in China, how have you changed, how have you transformed the philosophy, the operating model of your company, of your corporation? Because for us it would illustrate the kind of changes that maybe others have to make in China also. And that would impact the economic activity in China. Would you like to speak about that, please?
Yeah, thank you. And good afternoon. And first, I think I first introduce my company. And I think the simple introduce the
Can
company.
everybody hear? No. I think if you could just put the mic a little bit closer to you, a little bit higher. Yeah. Same as Dr. Ahluwalia.
Better?
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, maybe a little better sound. And I think introduce first my company. I think the simple introduce the company is, I think the mature the company is. For example, I can no more than 3 seconds introduce a company that biggest soft drink company in the world. Which company it is? I think everyone know that is Coca-Cola. If I say the biggest company in India, also the audience in the meeting know that Tata. But if I say my company, the biggest home developer in the world, who know you outside China? So that need a little bit time to introduce our company. That my company that built that in 1994. And 1994. And this year, that's the 30th anniversary. So I'm pleasure give an opportunity to intro something in there. I want to give some story. Of course, give time, the 12 or 13 minutes. So when the past time, the overtime over, please cut me. That first story, that the snow of Kilimanjaro. As a fan of outdoor adventure, I went up to the peaks of 7 continents, including Mount Everest, and crossed the South and the North Poles. The first summit I climbed was Kilimanjaro. The Snows of Kilimanjaro, written by Ernest Hemingway in 1936, is a novel I enjoyed reading. In 2002, I went up to the peak of Kilimanjaro. I was looking around, but could not see a single sign of snow. I kept encountering into signs of climate change as I carried on my adventure journeys in other parts of the world. A question came to my mind: what is our environmental footprint? My company did some research and found out that China's resource-intensive construction has created huge impact on the global environment. China consumes half of the world's concrete and 2/3 of steel. China imports half of the timber supplied by the world's in forest, 40% of which those construction site China. Construction. Hello. Construction use of homes in China put more CO2 into the atmosphere than Indian as a country. As China's largest residential property developer, I felt we must find a new way of construction to reduce our environmental footprint. I decided to get opinions from Greenpeace. As a global champion in environmental conservation, I came to the Beijing office of Greenpeace and met with a head of China operation, Mr. Lu, a smart guy from Hong Kong. Apparently, my visit took him by surprise, as normally companies try to stay away from them. He asked me curiously, "Why did you come to us?" I answered, "As China's largest residential property developer, I know that someday you will come to see me. I think it is better I come to see you first." Mr. Lu laughed, "As yours." He then did two things. First, he arranged a trip for me to fly over the rainforest. From the air overview, I saw a striking view of how much rainforest was lost to legal and illegal logging in the Amazon rainforest. It is said to visually associated logging in Amazon with construction in China. The other thing Mr. Lu did was to arrange a meeting with the World Wildlife Fund, that WWF, to help us track the source of timber used in our construction. That's the first story. Second story, prefabrication and going green. I was inspired by the Amazon trip and started to push for a change to reduce the use of timber in our construction. Prefabrication came to my attention as a mature technique widely used in industrialized countries. By switching to prefabrication, we can save 87% of timber in the construction site, among other materials. Chinese developers and contractors are unwilling to use these techniques due to higher cost and technical threshold. Unlikely developed countries, the Chinese government does not provide policy or financial incentives for these new techniques. Vanke became the first Chinese developer that switched to prefabrication in 2007. Today, after 6 years, 50% of the properties we develop are prefabrication. We are aiming at achieving 100% prefabrication in 2015. Why did we make the switch? First, this technique helps us to significantly improve product quality. Secondly, green building is a future way of construction. If we don't change it now, we will sooner or later be caught by regulation or even penalty. It is a better we take our first step forward. We realized we should not limit our attention to the construction process. The usage of homes actually accounts for 1/3 of China's total energy consumption and emission. So the question is not just about how to build homes, but what type of homes to build. We must build green homes that save energy and reduce emission in the operation stage. Chinese government did not have a green building rating scheme until 2007. Then Chinese government launched the Green 3-star standard, which is comparable to the LEED Gold in the US. But unlike Europe countries, the green standard is neither compulsory nor subsidized. It is completely left to the developer's discretion. In 2009, all of China's Green 3-star projects were built by Vanke, 100%. The reason very simple, because that year only one Green 3-star project was certified in China, and that one was built by Vanke. Since then, for every 2 3-star projects built in China, one was built by Vanke. We are aiming to make sure that all projects meet Green 3 stars by 2016. At the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in 2009, Chinese government announced an ambitious target to reduce carbon intensity by 40 to 45% by 2020. If Vanke achieves its green objective, we will contribute to about 0.12% of the carbon reduction. That reduction target. If the whole industry followed us, we would be able to achieve 12% of China's carbon reduction target. That's the second story. And the last one, that from Copenhagen to Warsaw, if the construction of green homes is more costly, why did we choose the hard way? Simply put, when I think about the future, it is true that when the market is good, it's hard to convince customers to pay extra dollars for green. But when the economy goes down, customers start to care more about quality, comfort, as well as the operation costs of properties. Then the green buildings becomes an attractive choice. A shift from shareholders to stakeholders will give Vanke advantage in terms of brand image and long-term competitiveness. In 2009, we started to work with WWF on a rainforest conservation program. 3 years later, WWF US invited me to sit on their board. Going green enables Vanke to connect it more easily with like-minded communities in China and abroad. In 2009, I attended the UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen. As the head of the Chinese Civil Society delegation, I happened to stay at the same hotel as the head of the Chinese government delegation. When we came across each other, I was surprised and asked me, "Why are you coming to the UN climate conference? This should be left to the government." I explained, "We support China's carbon reduction target and want to play our part to accomplish it." It was pleased to hear my intention, but remained skeptical about our ability to make an enduring impact. The last paragraph. Last year, in November, the climate change conference took place in Warsaw. The head of a Chinese delegation was still the same person, same guy. But the situation was very different. This time, Chinese government partnered with Vanke to build the China Pavilion. Together, we organized the Vanke Day to facilitate discussion on environmental sustainability. Vanke was chosen as a partner because of our serious commitment. I believe this is also the reason why Cloud kindly invited me to GrowthNet. For me and Vanke, it is a privilege to exchange ideas with peers from around the world and address some common issues we face. I look forward to some more discussion with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. What you said about your company and how it changed and how it has been deeply committed to green buildings movement in China, I must tell you that in the early 90s in India, we set up a green buildings center in Hyderabad. And when I say we, I mean the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is the national organization of industry, in partnership with the Godrej Group. I introduced you to Mr. Godrej earlier, this family, and the Director General of the CII is sitting here, Mr. Banerjee. They came together to set up the Green Building Center, which has driven a very strong green buildings movement in this country. So I think we should actually share information and learn from each other. I think that will be very good. The second point is, I think many companies should actually get a copy of your statement, because it would be a learning for them as to what can be achieved by individual companies in the area of climate change and reduction of emissions. Thank you very much for your remarks. I want to turn to Dr. Ahluwalia on the broader issue of growth in the world, and especially in the growth of the emerging economies. You've heard about China and what they're doing, and of course you've just come back from there, so you have immediate impressions of China and its economy. You're seeing what's happening in different emerging economies around the world. So do you see a differentiation? There'll be different levels of growth in different emerging economies. I mean, maybe land up with seeing a lot of economies maybe around 3 to 4%, maybe some at 5 to 6%, maybe China on its own at about 7.5, 8%. Do you see this differentiation coming, or do you think things will level out, or how do you see the growth situation in the emerging economies?
It's a tough question to answer, but you know, my feeling is that obviously there'll be differentiation. Different developing countries, emerging market countries face different kinds of constraints. I think the idea that all emerging markets are going to have one future, which could be either good or bad, is quite wrong. I do think that between now and, let's say, 20 years ago, the growth capacity of a very large number, at least of the larger developing countries, has now improved quite a bit. But that doesn't mean that we're all necessarily going to be growing rapidly. It depends on how we manage the policy situation. It's quite likely that at any given time, I mean, there'll be short-term deviations around everybody's long-term trend. I mean, for example, my view is that the current low growth rate in India, 2 years of 5% or a teeny bit less than 5%, represents a short-term aberration. We've been knocked off what I would say is, for India, a sustainable growth path would be somewhere between 7 and 8%. Okay? And the reason for that is that I think the macroeconomics can be put right. I mean, it's not actually absolutely right at the moment, but it is getting better. I mean, it's got much better than it was, say, a year ago. There's lots of the institutional capacities, lots of savings and investment capacities. Now that, you know, varies across developing countries. I mean, China, of course, is remarkable in the sense that they have savings rates of over 50%, now come down to 50. India had a savings rate at one time which went up to about 35, 36. It's now come down to 30. But you know, even a 30% savings rate is actually pretty good if what you're targeting for is a 7 or even 8% GDP growth, because with the 30% savings and maybe 2% current account deficit, you could easily have a 32% investment rate. And India can certainly go back a little bit higher. But many of the other developing countries, whether it's South Africa or Turkey, Brazil, their savings rates are much lower. So that if you've got a savings rate which is below 20%, it's a little difficult to imagine that you're going to have the same growth rate as, say, an economy that manages a savings rate of 34 and 35%. So emerging markets will differ. I think, though, that virtually all these countries are now in a position where their capacity for sustainable growth is much better than it was 10, 20 years ago. And therefore, the trend growth rate on which they'll operate will be higher than it was earlier. They have a lot of catching up to do in terms of productivity. I mean, you can see that in any industry. The difference is that when you haven't got the capacity to catch up, the difference will remain. So I think in the emerging markets, looking 10 years ahead, maybe 20 years ahead, it's going to be whether they're able to put in place the critical policies needed for that particular country to achieve its growth potential. And those policies may not be the same across all emerging markets. But you know, the secular decline in the growth rate of advanced economies is not going to change. I mean, they're not going to grow at 3+%. They're at the moment growing at about 1.5%. They may take it up to 2%. The question is, can the emerging markets as a group, individual countries will obviously get knocked off for a couple of years. Can the emerging markets as a group start growing at something like, as a group, something like 6%, in which some of the countries would do better? China, of course, is, for the last 30 years, been growing at 10%. So the Chinese experience is absolutely unique in the sense that it's had double-digit growth for a very long period, and there are unique circumstances and institutions that have made it possible. It's very commendable. But you know, other countries can learn from that and do whatever is necessary in their environment to come closer to that level of performance. So I remain basically bullish on the emerging markets as a group. And for India, I think we should recognize that the present level of growth is an aberration, it's too low, and we need to take it back up. You know, people sometimes talk about 8%, 9%, 10%. That's a little unrealistic. I mean, if you look at the last 10 years or so of India, and you clean the series to get rid of periods, you know, the favorable effect of boom years. I mean, there are statistical techniques that enable you to do that. Our kind of cleaned up growth rate that we have achieved is 7.5%, okay? And I don't see any reason why with a bit of improvement in policy we can't get back to that. And I would say that with better policy, we should be able to do better than that. That's why I think we ought to be aiming at getting to 8% and maintaining that for 20 years. Now, I think there are going to be constraints because it's not an unconstrained world. I mean, one of the biggest constraints that we have to face is going to be energy. And everybody has to face that. Energy supplies are limited. It's high cost. We are an import-dependent country. So how do we get used, how do we gear ourselves up to ensure the maximum possible amount of energy efficiency? I mean, you spoke about buildings, and Chairman Wang talked about what he's been doing in that area, but that's a crucial area for India also. We've done some long-term simulations of how can you bring India's energy requirements down. And the total consumption of electricity, out of the total consumption in the economy, almost 40% is the electricity consumed inside buildings for lighting, heating, and of course appliances. So lots of moves towards greater energy efficiency, better building design, more kind of energy efficient systems, and all of that will have to be supported by a combination of regulatory action and frankly also energy pricing, which is actually a very sensitive issue. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think we need the public debate to recognize India cannot achieve a high growth rate based on cheap energy because the world of cheap energy is gone. So either we adjust to a world of expensive energy and then look at efficiencies to achieve growth, or else we'll just founder. And that's a very big challenge. Similarly, I think we have challenges in water management. That's not just true of India, it's true of China, it's true of every country. And I think the transformation we're going to see in urbanization, which China has seen and has focused on. I mean, when I was there, I think 3 days before that, they just put out a sort of major paper on what urbanization is going to imply in China. We need to do exactly that in our situation. So these are not, I think what I'd like to say is these are not just little unfinished bits here and there. I mean, too much of the discussion on reforms is about one particular reform that didn't get done. I think if you ask yourself what are the strategic reforms we have to do, they are getting the macro right, which I think is one of the easiest. getting the energy stuff right over the medium term, which is tough, getting water right, which is very difficult. And I mean, since Rakesh is sitting here, he has just produced a major report on what we have to do on transport. These are new areas and new dimensions. And frankly, I think we need a roadmap. How much of this can we do in the next 10 years? Not when is this little thing which we thought was going to happen last year, which hasn't happened, when is it going to be done? The debate should shift away from that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's normal for us to have a short Q&A, but I'm not going to have that because we are out of time. And we have 5 outstanding CEOs in the hall right now who are going to come on to tell you the CEO's perspective on the global landscape. So I'm going to conclude this session now. Thank my panel, Dr. Ahluwalia, Mr. Wang Huiyao, Mr. Wang Shi, and Clyde. I think we could have carried on for some time, yes, but I think in the interest of time, we will conclude now. And thank you very much for being here.